At exactly 4:15 GMT this morning, a decision signed in Ottawa may have triggered the first strategic fracture between the United States and Canada in more than half a century. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney authorized an emergency order freezing exports of uranium, lithium, and strategic nickel valued at nearly $468 billion annually to the United States, materials that sit at the heart of America's nuclear energy grid and next-generation defense batteries. Within 27 minutes, officials confirmed that President Donald Trump had called an emergency national security briefing in Washington, warning that parts of the U.S. energy and defense supply chain could begin stalling within 48 hours. Yet remarkably, much of the mainstream media is still framing this as a routine trade disagreement. It isn't. Subscribe right now, because the timeline behind this crisis is unfolding hours before traditional outlets are ready to tell you the full story. In the next 12 minutes, I'm going to break down 3 critical facts that most people haven't seen yet. First, we'll uncover why Canada's sudden export freeze wasn't just about trade, but a calculated geopolitical pressure move aimed directly at Washington. Second, we'll examine the economic shockwave worth more than $1 trillion that could ripple across North America's energy and defense industries. And finally, at the end of this video, I'll reveal the 3 possible scenarios that could unfold within the next 96 hours, including one outcome that could permanently reshape the balance of power between the United States and its closest ally. To understand why this moment matters, we need to slow down and examine the 4 critical layers behind Canada's decision, because on the surface it looks like a trade dispute. But when you follow the numbers, the supply chains, and the timing, it starts to resemble a strategic pressure maneuver aimed directly at Washington. Let's begin with the first piece of evidence: the resources themselves. Canada's order specifically targeted uranium, lithium, and nickel, 3 materials that form the backbone of North America's advanced energy infrastructure. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, nearly 42% of the uranium used in American nuclear reactors is processed through Canadian supply networks. At the same time, Canada supplies roughly 31% of the nickel used in U.S. defense manufacturing and an estimated 28% of lithium inputs for next-generation battery systems. Those numbers may sound technical, but their implications are enormous. Nuclear reactors across the United States generate about 20% of the nation's electricity. If uranium supply chains begin to tighten, even temporarily, energy markets react instantly. Futures traders reportedly began recalculating supply risk within 18 minutes of the Ottawa announcement, and several analysts warned that prolonged disruption could send energy prices surging across North America. But energy isn't the only pressure point. Lithium and nickel are essential components in military-grade battery systems, drone technology, and electric vehicle manufacturing, which has become a strategic industry for the United States. That means the order doesn't just affect the economy, it potentially affects defense readiness and industrial capacity. Now let's look at evidence number 2, the timing. Prime Minister Mark Carney signed the order only hours after the U.S. Commerce Department circulated draft proposals for new tariffs targeting Canadian lumber and energy exports. According to trade analysts, those tariffs could have impacted more than $110 billion in annual Canadian exports. So the timeline begins to look less accidental and more like a preemptive countermeasure. Carney, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, is widely known for approaching geopolitical tensions through economic leverage rather than military rhetoric. In other words, if Canada wanted to send a signal to Washington without escalating into open confrontation, supply chains would be the pressure point of choice. A senior economist at a major European bank described the move bluntly. This is not symbolic. This is a precision economic signal. And that leads us to evidence number 3, the immediate reaction inside Washington. Within 27 minutes, reports emerged that President Donald Trump had convened an emergency meeting with the National Security Council. Officials reportedly reviewed contingency plans related to strategic mineral reserves and alternative import channels, including potential shipments from Australia and South America. But here's where things become complicated. Even if alternative suppliers step in, reconfiguring industrial supply chains takes time. Mining contracts, transportation routes, and refining capacities are not things that can be adjusted overnight. Some analysts estimate that fully replacing Canadian mineral flows could require 6 to 12 months of logistical restructuring. And that's assuming the global market has enough spare capacity to absorb the shock. This is why several financial analysts have started discussing the possibility of a $1 trillion ripple effect across North American industry. Supply interruptions in critical minerals don't just affect one sector. They cascade across energy production, manufacturing, transportation, and technology development. At this point, it's worth pausing for a moment. If you're starting to see how interconnected this situation really is, hit the like button, because understanding the scale of these supply chains is the key to understanding why this story is moving so quickly. Now let's examine evidence number 4, the strategic alliance factor. For decades, the United States and Canada have maintained one of the most integrated defense relationships in the world through the NORAD command structure, which coordinates aerospace defense across the continent. Their economies are also deeply intertwined through trade agreements and industrial partnerships. That's precisely why this decision is so unusual. Economic disagreements between the two countries are not new. Disputes over lumber, agriculture, and energy have surfaced many times before, but rarely have they escalated into measures that touch strategic resources tied to national security industries. This is where several geopolitical observers have begun drawing comparisons to other forms of economic leverage used globally. Strategic resources, whether energy, rare earth minerals, or advanced technology components, are increasingly being used as tools of geopolitical negotiation. One voice who weighed in on the situation was billionaire investor Warren Buffett, who reportedly commented during a private industry forum that disruptions in strategic minerals could trigger market reactions far larger than the public currently understands. Another perspective came from retired U.S. General David Petraeus, who has often spoken about the strategic importance of supply chains. In a recent policy discussion, he emphasized that modern geopolitical competition increasingly revolves around control of industrial infrastructure rather than traditional battlefield power. In other words, the real battleground may not be military deployments, it may be supply routes, resource contracts, and industrial capacity. And when you combine all 4 pieces of evidence, the resource leverage, the political timing, the rapid response in Washington, and the strategic alliance context, you begin to see why this situation is drawing so much attention from analysts around the world. Because this isn't just about Canada and the United States. It's about how modern geopolitical influence is exercised in an interconnected economic system. When supply chains stretch across continents and industries rely on tightly balanced resource flows, even a single executive order can trigger ripple effects far beyond the country that issued it. Which brings us to the question everyone is asking right now: what happens next? Because according to several analysts monitoring the situation, the next 72 to 96 hours could determine whether this standoff stabilizes through negotiation or escalates into a far larger economic confrontation. And that is exactly what we're about to explore next. So where does this crisis go from here? According to several geopolitical analysts and market observers, the next 96 hours could determine whether this situation cools down quietly or turns into the most serious economic rupture between the United States and Canada in decades. There are 3 realistic scenarios now being discussed behind closed doors in Washington, Ottawa, and Brussels. Scenario 1: full de-escalation and strategic compromise. In this outcome, both governments step back from the edge before the economic pressure begins to cascade through supply chains. Negotiators from the United States and Canada could quickly reopen talks on the proposed tariffs and mineral exports, possibly under the supervision of G7 economic mediators. Under this scenario, Canada might partially restore uranium and lithium exports while Washington delays or softens its planned tariffs. The result would be a carefully staged compromise designed to calm financial markets and stabilize North American industry. If that happens, the crisis may fade into the background as a high-stakes negotiating tactic rather than a long-term rupture. But analysts warn that this is not the most likely outcome, because both leaders now face domestic political pressure not to appear weak. Scenario 2. Partial compliance and controlled tension. In the second scenario, neither side fully backs down. Canada could maintain restrictions on certain strategic minerals while allowing limited shipments to continue under new licensing conditions. At the same time, Washington might move forward with some of the tariff proposals but delay others. This would create a slow-burn standoff rather than an immediate confrontation. Markets would likely remain volatile, industries would scramble to adjust supply chains, and governments across Europe and Asia might begin quietly preparing alternative mineral supply routes. In many ways, this scenario could be even more disruptive over time because prolonged uncertainty tends to erode investment and destabilize industrial planning. But there is a third scenario that some analysts are beginning to whisper about. Scenario 3. Complete breakdown and global economic shock. If negotiations collapse entirely, the dispute could escalate into a full-scale North American trade confrontation. Canada could expand its export restrictions, potentially including additional strategic minerals. The United States, in response, could impose sweeping tariffs or retaliatory trade measures worth hundreds of billions of dollars. That kind of escalation would not remain contained within two countries. Energy markets, electric vehicle manufacturing, defense contractors, and global commodity exchanges could all feel the shock. Financial analysts warn that under extreme conditions, the disruption could ripple through industries valued at well over $1 trillion globally. And once supply chains begin shifting on that scale, reversing the damage becomes extremely difficult. Which means the real question now is not whether tensions exist. The real question is, which of these three paths Washington and Ottawa will choose before the clock runs out. So here we are. The clock is ticking, and the relationship that once defined North American stability is suddenly under pressure from a single strategic decision. What began at 04:15 GMT in Ottawa has now triggered emergency discussions in Washington, shaken energy markets, and forced global analysts to reconsider just how fragile modern supply chains really are. Whether this crisis ends in compromise, prolonged tension, or a full economic rupture will likely be decided in the coming days. But one thing is already clear. The balance of leverage between the United States and Canada has shifted, even if only temporarily. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Washington pushed too far with its trade pressure? Or did Ottawa just open a dangerous new chapter in economic warfare? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because this story is still unfolding.